Today, you're gonna understand why pharmacological treatment for ADHD is one of the most widely accepted and effective medication treatments in psychiatry for those with ADHD. You'll also understand the signs that indicate you might have ADHD, the two main categories of ADHD symptoms, and we'll delve deeper into how these medications work. We'll explore the mechanisms of action, what they exactly do in your brain, as well as the risks, side effects, and precautions you need to take if you start pharmacological treatment for ADHD. Got it? The first thing I want you to grasp is that ADHD stands for Attention Deficit Hyperactivity Disorder. There are two major sets of ADHD symptoms, the ones related to inattention and the ones related to hyperactivity. In the inattention category, you tend to procrastinate, leaving tasks until the last minute. You have difficulty sustaining attention, meaning it's hard for you to focus on one thing without getting distracted. You easily get distracted and have a tendency to lose objects and forget appointments, all within this inattention category. And then you have the other symptoms related to hyperactivity. Being physically restless and impatient for things to start or end. If you have ADHD, you might get really anxious for something to start already, like in a meeting when it's past the scheduled end time. You get agitated because you want it to be over. You might talk a lot and sometimes interrupt others while speaking, and you tend to make more impulsive decisions. We can even think about impulsive sexual decisions, promiscuity, doing things on a whim, you know. Impulse buying, feeling the urge, bought it, spent money. Using substances impulsively, like alcohol, drugs, etc. So, those are two sets of symptoms, but all part of the same disorder. But here's the interesting thing, most people with ADHD don't exhibit those hyperactive symptoms too strongly. We categorize ADHD into three subtypes: inattentive, hyperactive, and combined. 70% of people fall under the inattentive type, and only 20% are the hyperactive type. You know what that means? 20% of people emphasize and show more hyperactive symptoms. For most people with ADHD, the problems they face in life are more related to the inattentive symptoms: procrastination, difficulty organizing, sustaining attention, getting easily distracted, losing things, forgetting appointments, and so on. Now, when you think of ADHD, what comes to mind? Especially during our childhood, we imagine ADHD as a child who is very fidgety, constantly interrupting the teacher, hard to calm down, always getting up from the chair, disturbing the class, the hyperactive type. But guess what? 70% of people with ADHD don't have these hyperactive symptoms in a very emphatic way, so many of them go through childhood and adolescence without getting diagnosed. That was my case. I had the luck and misfortune of having ADHD, but I was also quite smart at school, so I could pass the tests. I wasn't hyperactive, but I had trouble organizing myself. I could only pay attention in class a few days before the exam, and then I'd learn everything I needed to pass the test. If I had received treatment early on, my life might have been very different, maybe fewer failed relationships, fewer problems with impulsive purchases, more productivity and efficiency at work, and better sleep. But the inattentive type of ADHD, despite being the most common, is sometimes the least diagnosed. The second thing you need to understand is that ADHD is a neurodevelopmental disorder and is highly genetic and hereditary. When we talk about ADHD, we are not talking about something you acquire. It's not like walking down the street, touching a pole, rubbing your eye, and suddenly you have ADHD. No, it doesn't work like that. It's also not like depression and anxiety, where you develop them over time. ADHD is more something that happens to you, influenced primarily by genetics, rather than something you acquired or developed. The estimates suggest that 75% of ADHD symptoms are genetically generated, and the remaining 25% are influenced by the environment. So, we need to look at the genetic factors that increase the chances of having ADHD. And interestingly, there are studies showing, for example, that 50% of the children of a couple where one parent has ADHD will have the condition. 45% of children who spent 1 day or more in the neonatal ICU will show symptoms of ADHD. Symptoms usually appear before the age of 12, with most cases starting between 3 and 8 years old. Curiously, it is twice as common in males, but that could be because females tend to have the inattentive type more frequently, and since they often perform better in school environments, ADHD often goes unnoticed in them during childhood and adolescence. So in adulthood, a woman may start wondering what's wrong, and many never seek help. It's quite common for ADHD to go untreated because it's still seen as a childhood disorder, and people don't talk much about ADHD in adulthood. Alright, got it. It's essential to realize that having ADHD doesn't bring any cognitive or social advantage to the individual. There's a myth that maybe having ADHD is like having a superpower. In reality, having ADHD increases your risk of various social and cognitive problems. For instance, statistically, people with ADHD are more likely to be involved in car accidents. Both men and women with ADHD have a much higher chance of an unintended pregnancy. They are also more likely to have problems with the police and substance abuse. So, having ADHD doesn't give you any advantage. Despite what some people may romanticize on social media, there's no benefit to it. Understanding this, let's move on to how ADHD medications work. The class of medications used to treat ADHD is called psychostimulants. We mainly have 3 brands: Ritalin, Concerta, and Vyvanse. How do these medications work? Both Ritalin, Concerta, and Vyvanse, being psychostimulants, act on the central nervous system. They truly affect your brain. They work by increasing the levels of 2 neurotransmitters called dopamine and norepinephrine. A neurotransmitter is a substance released by one or more neurons. This substance not only affects the next neuron but also impacts several neurons at the same time. That's why it's called a neuromodulator, not just a neurotransmitter. A neurotransmitter affects the next neuron in line, while a neuromodulator affects multiple neurons in that region, like a can of paint splashing all around. Norepinephrine is a neuromodulator that, as a standard characteristic, increases the excitability of neurons. It makes the neurons affected by it more excitable, more stimulable, and more active. As a result, norepinephrine is associated with a mental state of being alert, awake, and focused. When we think of focus, alertness, being awake, we think of norepinephrine. It's the opposite of being asleep. On the other hand, when we look at dopamine, it's a neuromodulator associated with a mental state of seeking, in a positive sense. It's like when you have a goal and are eager to accomplish it. You want to solve things, take action, and move forward. It's the mode of action. You know when you sit in front of the computer and say, "I'm going to take care of these tasks now," or when you wake up well-rested, have a coffee, and have a free day, and you feel like you can tackle anything. That's a dopamine state. So, on one side, we have norepinephrine, which is associated with being awake and alert. On the other, we have dopamine, associated with the mode of action, seeking to resolve things. Throughout the day, there's a natural balance of these neurotransmitters in healthy individuals. In the morning and early afternoon, your body is in a more dopamine state, focused on seeking and doing things. From the late afternoon until night, you transition into a more serotonin state. Serotonin is another neurotransmitter associated with a mental state of contentment, not wanting, but appreciating. When you have a lot of serotonin circulating in the central nervous system, you're in a good mood, feeling satisfied with what you have, and relaxed. So, there's a natural balance of these neurotransmitters in healthy individuals. But in ADHD, there are lower levels of these neurotransmitters circulating, so people with ADHD naturally have less dopamine and norepinephrine. This means they have more difficulty staying alert and also have more difficulty seeking and taking action. You might think, if there's a lack of dopamine and norepinephrine, shouldn't people with ADHD just feel down and lacking energy? Shouldn't they have depression since dopamine and norepinephrine are responsible for wanting to do things and staying alert? Well, you're partially right. People with ADHD do experience low energy and lack of motivation. However, their behaviors, always changing stimuli, going from one thing to another, are an unconscious way of stimulating themselves because, when they engage in new activities, their dopamine levels rise. You see, their brain senses that it's understimulated, with low dopamine levels, and it starts doing things to increase dopamine levels. So, when you have a child with ADHD in the classroom, constantly getting up and down, leaving the chair, going to the window, closing it, and chatting with a classmate, where does this urge come from? It comes from the brain trying to boost dopamine levels. The brain wants to reach an okay dopamine level so that the child can concentrate. You'll notice that many people with ADHD can concentrate better if they're stimulating themselves. That's why, in a work environment, someone with ADHD might put on some music, tap their foot, fiddle with a pen, and so on. They unconsciously stimulate themselves enough to reach a dopamine level where they can concentrate. So, what do the medications do? They increase dopamine and norepinephrine levels to a point where the need for self-stimulation diminishes. When you take a stimulant medication, you might wonder, isn't it strange? If you're already hyperactive and you take something that makes you more active, why would you become more focused? Well, it's not strange at all. Now that you understand the reason behind the hyperactivity, you see that the medication is actually addressing that reason. It's solving the lack of dopamine and norepinephrine. That's why ADHD medications are among the most effective in psychiatry. Over 70% of people who receive treatment report significant improvements. But, of course, when it comes to medication, there are side effects. Let me tell you about the risks associated with ADHD medications. First, there's a risk of tolerance. Any medication that has an immediate effect poses a high risk of developing tolerance. So, during the first days and weeks of using Ritalin, for example, you might feel its effects much stronger than after a few months or a year. Your body develops tolerance, and to continue experiencing positive effects, your psychiatrist might increase your dose or switch to another medication. That's what we call rotating the medications. Next is the risk of abuse. Because Ritalin, Vyvanse, and Concerta have immediate effects, there's a chance you might abuse them. Abusing the medication means using more than the psychiatrist prescribed. Doing so can lead to physical dependence on the medication. So, it's essential not to abuse the medication but to use it as your psychiatrist recommended, alright? Finally, insomnia is a common side effect, especially if you take the medication later in the day. If your medication has a 10-hour effect, for example, take it around 7 a.m., so it lasts until 5 p.m. Taking a dose later in the day can increase the risk of insomnia. Also, many patients experience a loss of appetite. Some see it as an advantage because they want to lose weight, but others might not like the idea. For some patients trying to gain weight or build more muscle mass, they might need support from a nutritionist to manage these issues. And that's it for today. Don't forget to like this video, comment what you think and share it with more people. Thank you and see you next time.